Morning.
Well, let me introduce you, Bill. You always introduce yourself, and then let's take advantage of the opportunity. I'm Bob Schmidt, and I'm here today to interview Bill Pollock, or let Bill Pollock talk about his book, which has been reprinted after many weeks of being out of print. And today is July 5th, 2012, and we're in Sherman Oaks at Bill's house. So why don't we take a look at your book, Bill?
Well, this is what it looks like. And the name of the book is Red Wheels and White Sidewalls, and that pretty much describes the car, which was black with red wheels and white sidewalls. And it was a make of a car that most of you have probably never heard of. It was called an Allard, which this is what the grill looks like. And if you see one of these grills coming up behind you, please get over to the side of the road, because they're very fast, as it turned out. Anyhow, books are not written. Books write themselves, but people don't write books, or at least I don't think so, and I didn't start out to write a book. I was really concerned that I was getting older, and my kids were growing up, and my grandkids were getting older and getting jobs and doing things, and I wanted them to have some sort of a resource or something they could look up and see, what did Grandpa do before he just sat in the chair and drooled? And so it was just more or less notes, and because of that, it's not a car book, even though it's got a car on the cover, but it's not just about cars. There are, of course, cars in it, because a lot of it was about some racing that I did, but it's really a series of adventures that started out when I was just a little kid, and I was probably 5, 6 years old in New York, and where I was born. And I captured toads, and they were my cars, and I made little cities for them. And that was like the opening thing in the book. And some people say, "Good Lord, it's a book about toads." No, it's not a book about toads. And then my dad was a songwriter, and he was hired by 20th Century Fox to come out and write music for Shirley Temple and a lot of people back in the 40s, the 30s, when the studios were just making musicals. That's all that they wanted to do. And my fun was that my dad would take me to the studio and turn me loose, and his cottage was right next to the back lot, as they called it, at Fox. And so I could go into the streets of New York or the streets of San Francisco or just about anything and play cops and robbers or cowboys and Indians or whatever we did with my brother. And it was wonderful. And then occasionally I was asked to take Miss Temple, or Shirley Temple, as you might have heard of her, and keep her busy for a half an hour or so while my dad rewrote some music. And then, of course, as I grew older, we moved to Encino, and we had horses. I broke horses. I rode. And then when the war broke out, I decided I did not want to be in the infantry. And I wanted to fly airplanes. And I never even sat in an airplane. But that idea seemed really exciting to me. And it was either submarines or airplanes. I mean, that kind of extremes that I didn't want to miss a clue. And I wound up learning how to fly and being part of the Army Air Corps, and actually eventually flying an attack bomber, which was a B-26, and it was exciting as hell. And some of the things that occurred during this period were, when I look back on it, they're pretty funny. And some of them were pretty crazy, and I think, how do we live through our youth? It just appalls me that some of the things that we thought were okay, which I document in the book. When I think about it, I think, this is why you want to have young, really in an army or of any kind, You want young people. They're not going to think too much.
Who are convinced they're going to live forever.
Oh boy. Yes, for sure. And of course, after the war, I came home and was courting my soon-to-be wife. But in the meantime, I was exposed to the post-war cars, and they were really dreadfully boring because the industry in our country hadn't had time to retool from. Ford was making B-24 bombers. It was going to take them a few minutes to get rid of all of the bombing gear and start making whatever it is that they were going to make. In the meantime, they cranked out whatever they were doing before the war. And they were the Chryslers and the whatever they were just not something you'd really want to play with or have fun with. And after flying airplanes, to get into these cars, it was just not much. And then all of a sudden, here comes an MGTC, which I just went. The minute I saw one with the tall 19-inch wire wheels and a knockoff hub that only Indianapolis racers had, and a fold-down windshield and cut-down doors. I mean, good Lord! I mean, this actually, when I look back, it was not a very good car. But then I thought it was dynamite, even though you needed a screwdriver to continually tighten the hinges on the doors because everything was in wood frames in those cars, and everything vibrated loose. So, the doors would tend to fly open if you didn't watch them all the time. But nevertheless, they were fabulous. And of course, the car felt differently. It was low, made all kinds of wild sounds. And you wanted to go play with it, and we did, and I did, and I turned out to be pretty good in driving. My first race at Palm Springs, I won the novice races. Of course, we were all novices then, and then I almost won the main event. And it was shortly right after that that I was invited to drive for someone else, and I thought, boy, I could see that even the minimum thing that we were doing with my own car, I was going to need a set of tires after 3 or 4 races, or at least have to change the oil, and that was a big deal. And the fact of driving a car for somebody else, I'd never even conceived of that. That was, wow. I mean, somebody has a car, they don't want to drive themselves. It was like found money, and I thought, wonderful, and I did.
Just to set the time period, when was your first race at Palm Springs?
It was in the late 49, I believe, 49 or 50, right around in there. And it was a brutally hot day. We went down to Palm Springs, and we were out on the concrete apron, and I remember everybody was just dying of the heat. And for some reason, the little TC just blew along, but that was the first time we'd ever seen a 120 Jaguar. And for some time, for years, the Jaguar company could not conceive of any temperature more than about 65 degrees. And so they had a beautiful little radiator, not like this, but a little radiator to cool this big 6-cylinder engine. Not going to work. And anybody in California take one look. Oh yeah, that thing's going to overheat, and boy did it. It got very hot, and the brakes got very hot, and the last thing I saw of that 120 was it disappeared in the Cholla at the end of the straightaway with Roger Barlow, who was the head of a company called International Motors, which was right near the Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard, and that was where a lot of the first new exciting cars were exposed. The first Healey's and the first Jags, the first MGs. Roger had a good handle on that. But it was, nevertheless, it was just really exciting. And then, and I started, these stories started to come out, and that's one of the fun things about not writing a book is just kind of opening up your mind and thinking back to the wonderful period, which this time period in the 50s was so exciting because um, I wasn't the only one that went crazy when they saw this little MG. There were literally hundreds of people at almost every major industry in Southern California, where I lived, the Northrops, the Douglases, the Lockheed. Everybody had a car club. They had an MG club. They had a Singer club. They had a Healy club. They had whatever it was. They had some kind of a little club, and this became like a farm team for the California Sports Car Club, which was just starting. And so all of a sudden we were putting on events, and thousands of people were showing up, and it was all amateur.
And this was the Cal Club?
The Cal Club really started it down here, and the SCCA Sports Car Club of America had the same sort of thing was going on up in the San Francisco, Northern California area, and back east. It was just simultaneously happening. But Southern California has always been the breeding ground of inventive thinking in terms of the hot rod movement. Was always far ahead of everybody else, and a lot of that fell over into sports cars. And so what we did with our cars and the way we did it, and it gave us a leg up and a big giant step ahead of everybody else, I think.
And the interesting thing about all the sports car, even when you were asked to drive somebody else's car, it was all amateur.
Yeah,
there was no such thing as a professional team or professional driver.
Just recently somebody said, well, when you drove that such and such a car, boy, that must have been a big payday for you. And I said, well, I think I did get lunch. It was. We were thrilled to be able to. When somebody said, "Would you like to drive the car?" I mean, get out of my way,
And to kind of amplify on your remark about how Southern California was the center of it, at the same time there was a big hot rod scene going on, which is a little bit different. And not far from here, down in Glendale, there was a guy named Frank Curtis who was building all the cars for Indianapolis. In the early 50s, every car that raced in Indianapolis was built by Frank Curtis.
That's true. And Frank eventually also started building a version of his Indy car for sports cars.
Yes.
And it was quite a good machine, too, by the way. And I drove one a couple of times. But yeah, there was so much of that going on, and I don't think, we were at the beginning of the recreation of a new sport, and that was a very unusual thing. Most of us have never lived long enough to see the beginnings of football or tennis or golf, or we read about those in history books. Well, this is quite a history book, but maybe in some regards it is. This was really the history of the beginning of a new kind of road racing, a new kind of car racing. Yes, they did race cars back in the Stutz Bearcat days, and those vintage things, but that was those were different kind of races. Those were straight lines, like from Poughkeepsie to wherever, and you stopped 5 times to put on new tires and fix the broken chain on the drive wheel, and it was more of a mechanical nightmare than it was a race. But the kind of racing we were doing was a gentleman's sport. It was like we were the polo players of automobiles, which I thought was really neat, and everybody had a different attitude than we see today.